The plane jolted violently, and Marcus Cole's stomach lurched as the roar of the engines drowned out everything else. Through the misty windows, the mountains of Alaska loomed like jagged teeth, their white peaks disappearing into the swirling clouds. His heart raced. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Outside, the weather was turning fast. Shit! Kyle, the young, inexperienced pilot, cursed under his breath as the storm struck with terrifying force. The once quiet skies were now filled with a deafening wind, rattling the aircraft as if it were a toy in the grip of a giant's hand. Marcus could see the panic in the pilot's eyes, a stark contrast to his own calculated calm. But even Marcus couldn't deny it. They were in trouble. "Hold on, everyone!" Kyle's voice came through the intercom, shaky and frantic. "We might have to divert to the nearest clearing. I don't know if we'll make it through this storm." The turbulence made every second feel like an eternity. Lucas, his fellow adventurer and close friend, grabbed Marcus's arm, his face pale with fear. "Are you sure about this?" Lucas's voice cracked. "I mean, this storm, it's insane. We should head back." Marcus glanced at the map on the table in front of him, his fingers tracing the narrow lines that represented the uncharted land they were headed toward. He could feel his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from something deeper. This was what he lived for, the unknown, the wild, untamed places few dared to tread. But this was different. The storm was unpredictable, fierce, and every minute they stayed in the air felt like tempting fate. "No," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now. I know the terrain. I know the risk. We're going to make it." But even as the words left his mouth, a gut-wrenching, ear-splitting crack echoed from below, and the plane shuddered violently. A jolt, a flash of light, and then nothing. For a moment the world went silent. No roaring engines, no howling wind, just the cold, suffocating quiet of the wilderness below them. The panic in Lucas's eyes mirrored Marcus's own growing realization. They were falling. The last thing Marcus remembered before everything went black was the sound of tearing metal and the sharp scream of a stressed engine giving way to chaos. When Marcus regained consciousness, the world had turned upside down. His body ached in ways he couldn't comprehend, and his head felt like it was splitting in two. Groggily, he pushed himself up, the smell of burnt fuel and pine trees choking him. The wreckage of the plane lay scattered around him, a twisted heap of metal and plastic buried in the snow. "Lucas?" He called out hoarsely, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer. He scanned the wreckage. His eyes locked on Kyle's lifeless body, pinned under a broken beam. His stomach churned. They weren't just stranded, they were alone. No sign of Lucas. No help. No way out. The storm had torn apart their plane, but it hadn't killed them, yet. The bitter reality sank in. They were deep in the Alaskan wilderness, hundreds of miles from civilization, and they had no choice but to survive. And survive, Marcus knew, would be harder than anything he'd ever faced. Protagonist and setting introduction. Marcus Cole was no stranger to the wilderness. A seasoned survivalist and former military tracker, he had spent most of his adult life in the most remote corners of the world. Alaska, with its vast, unspoiled wilderness, had been a dream expedition for him. But this was no longer an adventure. This was survival. The cold was relentless. His breath came out in ragged puffs as he struggled to stand, each movement painful as he searched for any sign of life. The storm hadn't let up. Snow blanketed everything in a thick layer, hiding the wreckage, hiding any hope of finding a way out. The icy gusts cut through him, making it harder to think clearly, but the urgency burned deep in his chest. He needed to find Lucas, or, at the very least, get out of the immediate danger. They couldn't survive if they stayed here. As he trudged through the deep snow, his mind raced, replaying the crash in vivid detail. Every decision had led him here, to the edge of a frozen nightmare. But there was no time to dwell on mistakes. Survival depended on what came next. Supporting character introduction. Lucas was more than just a partner in this expedition. He was Marcus's closest friend. Their bond had been forged over years of working together in some of the harshest environments on the planet. Lucas had always been the optimistic one, the voice of reason when Marcus's bold ambitions pushed them to the brink. But in this moment, Marcus wasn't sure if that optimism was enough to save them. A sound cut through the wind, a faint, desperate cry. Lucas. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The voice came from behind him, somewhere within the wreckage. He didn't hesitate. Without looking back, he pushed through the snow toward the sound, every step a battle against the frozen wilderness. Each second, each breath, counted. The storm raged on, but Marcus wasn't about to let the wild take another life. Not if he could help it. But what awaited him in the wreckage was something even more terrifying than he could imagine. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, its biting cold gnawing at Marcus's bones. His breath came in shallow gasps as he slogged through the snow, his legs heavy and stiff from the crash. The storm had intensified, and the landscape, once majestic, now looked like a hostile wasteland, a vast, unforgiving ocean of white that stretched for miles in every direction. The cry he'd heard earlier was faint, distant. But it was enough to drive him forward, to pull him from the dark, frozen reality of the crash site. He refused to accept that Lucas was lost. Not yet. Each step felt like wading through cement. The snow, thick and dense, clung to his boots and legs, dragging him down. The wreckage of the plane lay scattered across the tundra, twisted metal and broken plastic buried beneath a blanket of snow. The storm had transformed everything into a blur of white, disorienting and suffocating. Marcus had no map, no sense of direction. Only instinct and years of survival experience to guide him. He stumbled forward, heart pounding, scanning the wreckage for any sign of his friend. The snowstorm whipped through the trees, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But then, through the haze, something caught his eye. A shape. It was barely noticeable, a figure half hidden by the wreckage, buried beneath a pile of twisted metal. Panic surged through Marcus's chest as he sprinted toward it, slipping on the icy ground but forcing himself to keep moving. He reached the body, his hands shaking as he pulled away the debris. Lucas was alive, though barely. His face was pale, lips cracked and blue, his body bruised and battered. But he was breathing, shallow and weak. "Lucas!" Marcus shouted, kneeling beside him. "Come on, man, stay with me." Lucas groaned, his eyelids fluttering open, his pupils dilated. "Marcus, is it really you?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Yeah, it's me. You're gonna be okay, all right?" Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. He glanced around, assessing the situation. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and they were running out of time. He needed to get Lucas to shelter, somewhere safe, somewhere they could survive this. I thought I was dead," Lucas muttered, his eyes glazed with fever. "You're not dead," Marcus said firmly. "And you're not going to be. But we need to move. Now." With great effort, Marcus pulled Lucas to his feet, his friend stumbling but managing to stay upright. Together, they trudged through the snow, each step harder than the last. The storm had swallowed the world whole, leaving them in a desolate void of white. They had no fire, no shelter, and no food. The wreckage of the plane was their only source of resources, but it was scattered across a vast, frozen wilderness. They had nothing but their wits, and even that felt like it was slipping away with every passing hour. Marcus's mind raced as they moved, calculating their next step. They needed shelter. They needed warmth. They needed a way to survive the night. "How far do you think it is?" Lucas asked weakly, his voice laced with fear. "Don't worry about it," Marcus replied, trying to keep his tone reassuring, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. He had no idea how far it was, but they couldn't stop moving. "Just focus on staying with me." The hours passed in a blur. The storm's intensity showed no signs of letting up, and with every step, the freezing cold crept deeper into their bones. Marcus had been in freezing conditions before. He had survived worse, but never like this. The Alaska wilderness, vast and brutal, offered no mercy. The wind screamed in their ears, the snow obscured everything, and their bodies grew weaker with each passing moment. The landscape had become a relentless maze of white. They were lost, far from any civilization. The mountains loomed in the distance, but they were no beacon, they were a barrier. A reminder that escape, if it existed, was miles away. It would take days to reach any sort of safety, and that was only if they had the strength to keep going. Lucas's breathing was shallow now, his steps faltering. "I don't know if I can," he started, his voice faint, barely audible over the wind. "Stay with me, Lucas. You have to stay with me," Marcus urged, his grip firm on his friend's arm. He knew they couldn't afford to stop, not yet. "We're not quitting. We're not dying here." But even as Marcus spoke, he knew the truth. The storm was their greatest enemy, and it would not give them the luxury of time. They came across the remnants of a forest, dead trees, stripped of their branches and leaves by the cruel Alaskan winter. Marcus knew they needed firewood. It was their only hope for survival in the coming hours. If they didn't build a fire, they would freeze to death before the storm passed. He led Lucas to the base of one of the trees, where the snow had cleared just enough to expose some dry wood. With shaking hands, he began to gather whatever he could find, twigs, small branches, anything that could burn. His mind was focused solely on the task, every action automatic, driven by the primal instinct to survive. "We can't stay here," Lucas said weakly, his eyes glazed over. "We need to keep moving. There's no time. There's no moving if we freeze," Marcus snapped, the desperation creeping into his voice. He struck the matches he had saved from the wreckage, his hands trembling with cold. Finally, a spark. A flicker of flame. It caught, spreading slowly as the wind howled around them. The warmth was instant, a comforting relief against the biting cold. But Marcus knew it was only temporary. They had to find a way out of this hellscape. As they huddled around the fire, Marcus's mind raced with possible plans, but every option seemed equally impossible. They could try to find shelter in the mountains, but the terrain would be treacherous, or they could wait out the storm, assuming it would end before they succumbed to the cold. In the midst of the chaos, one thing was certain. The storm was relentless, and their chances of survival seemed to grow slimmer by the hour. Dramatic revelation. As the fire crackled and Lucas's condition worsened, Marcus's thoughts turned to the one thing that had driven him to this wilderness in the first place. The caves. The ones that held ancient relics, rumored to be hidden deep within the Alaskan wilderness. They were far from their original target, but if they could reach the caves, they might find shelter. They might find salvation. But was it too late? Could they even make it? He didn't know. But he would try. And as the wind howled louder, as the cold crept deeper into his bones, Marcus knew one thing for certain. If they didn't find shelter soon, they wouldn't survive the night. The fire flickered weakly in the growing darkness, its warmth nothing more than a feeble comfort against the unforgiving cold. Marcus sat huddled close to Lucas, his friend's shallow breathing the only sound that cut through the howling wind. The storm had not relented. If anything, it had grown fiercer, more determined to claim them. "Marcus," Lucas murmured, his voice weak, barely audible over the roar of the storm. "We can't stay here. I don't think I can. I don't think I can make it." His words were like a cold blade to Marcus's heart. He had been through hell before, but hearing his friend's voice crack with despair was different. Lucas was always the strong one, the one who had been there through every tough moment, the one who kept them grounded. Now it was Marcus who had to hold them both together. "You're going to make it, Lucas," Marcus said, his voice hard with determination. "I won't let you die out here." But even as he spoke, a bitter truth gnawed at him. The storm wasn't just an obstacle, it was a weapon. Every gust of wind, every flake of snow was another enemy to fight, and Marcus knew that time was running out. With a heavy heart, he stood and turned to survey their surroundings. The fire, though still burning, was losing ground against the wind, and their immediate shelter, the dead trees they had huddled against, wasn't enough. They needed to move. If they stayed here, they would freeze. "Lucas," Marcus said, kneeling beside his friend and shaking him lightly. "We need to move. We need to find shelter, or this storm is going to finish us." Lucas's eyes fluttered, his face pale and drawn. "The caves," he whispered, his voice filled with desperation. We're close, right? You said we were close?" Marcus hesitated, staring out into the relentless white blur. The caves. They were a myth, a whisper in the wind, a legend among survivalists and explorers. Some said they contained ancient relics hidden for centuries. Others said they were nothing more than a trap, a cruel deception that led men to their death. The thought of the caves had been a distant hope, something to cling to when all else seemed lost. But now, as the storm raged on and Lucas's condition deteriorated, that distant hope was all they had. "We're close," Marcus lied, pushing aside the gnawing doubt in his gut. "We just need to push a little farther." "You can make it?" Lucas gave a weak nod, his body trembling from the cold. Just don't leave me," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Please." "I won't," Marcus promised, his voice a low growl. "Stay with me. Stay strong. We'll get out of this." The journey forward was nothing like what Marcus had imagined. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind felt like it was coming straight from the heart of a glacier. Every step was a battle against the cold, every breath a struggle against the suffocating air. The trees, once thick with branches, now stood as gnarled, skeletal remains of the forest, their twisted limbs clawing at the sky in a macabre dance. Marcus's mind was focused entirely on the path ahead. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the caves, anything that might offer them refuge. He had no map, no guide. Just a vague memory of where he had seen the caves on a map long ago, a distant, almost unreachable place. They moved in silence, Lucas's ragged breaths the only sound between them. With every step, Marcus felt the weight of their situation pressing down on him. He had led them here, into the heart of the storm, and now it was up to him to get them out. The snow had thickened, and the wind had become almost unbearable, biting at their skin like shards of glass. Marcus's face was raw, his eyes squinting against the stinging gusts. His body was growing tired, his strength slipping away with each mile. The weight of Lucas's burden, his friend's condition, was dragging them both down. But still they pushed on. The landscape began to change as they climbed higher into the mountains, the trees growing sparse, replaced by jagged rocks and frozen ground. It was a stark, barren place, as if nature itself had given up on this part of the world. Marcus could feel the air thinning, the cold pressing in from every direction. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A dark opening in the side of the mountain, a narrow passageway that seemed to beckon them like a dark promise. The caves. The entrance was barely visible through the swirling snow, but it was unmistakable. "We're almost there," Marcus muttered, his voice a hoarse whisper. He turned to Lucas, whose eyes were half closed, his face pale and covered in a thin layer of frost. "Lucas, look. The caves. We're gonna make it." Lucas's head lolled toward him, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. I knew you could do it." Marcus helped Lucas to his feet, their progress slow and staggered. They moved toward the cave entrance, their legs shaking with exhaustion. The wind howled louder, the storm pushing them back, but Marcus gritted his teeth and kept moving. When they finally reached the cave, Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled Lucas inside, his heart racing with relief as the winds died down the moment they crossed the threshold. The cave was dark, its interior cold but shielded from the worst of the storm. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a fighting chance. Marcus helped Lucas to the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. The immediate danger of the storm had passed, but Lucas's condition had only worsened. His body was feverish, his eyes barely open, and his breathing was shallow. Marcus sat beside him, his mind racing. They were safe from the storm for now, but they were far from safe. The cave was a temporary refuge at best. There were no guarantees, no supplies. They were still deep in the wilderness, surrounded by dangers they couldn't even begin to fathom. "We need to rest," Marcus said, though he knew it wasn't enough. They couldn't rest for long. He needed to find food, warmth, something to keep them alive. He glanced around the cave, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The walls were jagged, the ground uneven. It wasn't a home, but it was a shelter, and for now, that was all that mattered. But as Marcus settled next to Lucas, a cold chill ran down his spine. The cave felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet. There was something about the place that made his skin crawl, but he pushed it aside. They had no choice. As the hours passed, and Lucas's condition worsened, Marcus fought the rising panic in his chest. The storm outside raged on, but the danger inside was just beginning. Twists and surprising connections. As night fell and the temperature dropped further, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the cave. The air seemed thicker, colder, as if something, or someone, was watching them from the shadows. And then, in the dim light, something caught his eye, a strange carving on the wall of the cave, partially hidden by the shadow. It was an ancient symbol, one that Marcus recognized. The same symbol he had seen in the old legends, the one connected to the very relics they had been searching for. But this was no relic hunt. This was survival. And the question lingered, was this cave truly their salvation, or had they stumbled into something far darker than they could imagine? The cave was a prison and a sanctuary in one. The howling winds outside were muffled by the stone walls, but the darkness inside pressed in on Marcus with a suffocating weight. The flickering glow of their small fire cast eerie shadows across the jagged walls, stretching them out like monstrous figures lurking just beyond sight. But it was the silence that gnawed at him the most. The silence that made him feel like he was being watched, like the cave itself was holding its breath, waiting. Lucas lay against the cold, uneven ground, his body racked with fever. His face was drawn, his skin pale as wax. His shallow breathing echoed in the cave, a constant reminder of their fragile grasp on life. Marcus could feel the panic rising in his chest, threatening to overtake him. They had made it to the cave, but now they were trapped. Trapped in a place that offered them no warmth, no food, no safety. For the first time, Marcus allowed himself to acknowledge the truth. They weren't going to survive this unless he did something drastic. The fire crackled weakly, its flame struggling against the oppressive cold of the cave. It had provided them with some relief, but the warmth was fleeting. The storm outside had turned into a full-blown blizzard, and it seemed to mock their fragile hopes. The snow had already started to seep into the cave through small crevices in the walls, a constant reminder of the world outside that was trying to kill them. Marcus was exhausted, bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. He had been running on pure instinct since the crash, and now that they had found shelter, his mind refused to let him rest. His every thought was consumed with survival, with finding a way to make it through the night, through the storm, through the seemingly endless hours that stretched before them. He stood, his legs shaky beneath him, and forced himself to move toward the back of the cave. The strange carvings on the walls still gnawed at him. They were ancient symbols, worn smooth with age, but there was something about them, a sense of familiarity that prickled at the back of his mind. He had seen them before, somewhere. Maybe in old texts. Maybe in the stories he had heard back home. Marcus ran his hand over the markings, tracing the curves and lines, his fingers feeling the grooves in the stone. He couldn't afford to waste time trying to decipher their meaning, but something told him the carvings were more than just decoration. They were a warning, a clue, something that could guide him if only he could unlock its meaning. A low groan from behind him broke his concentration. He turned quickly to see Lucas stirring, his eyes fluttering open. "Marcus," Lucas's voice was barely a whisper, strained and weak. I can't stay awake. Just leave me here." You have to save yourself?" "No," Marcus snapped, moving to his side. He could feel the fever radiating off his friend. I'm not leaving you, Lucas. You hear me? We're getting out of here. Both of us. Lucas tried to shake his head, his body trembling. It's too late. You don't understand. The storm, the cave. We're not alone. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He froze, looking down at his friend, his mind racing. What are you talking about? The cave, Lucas repeated, his eyes closing again. There's something in here, something watching us. It's not just the storm. It's something else. Marcus's stomach churned. He had dismissed the eerie feeling that had been crawling up his spine since they entered the cave. But now, with Lucas's fevered words ringing in his ears, the unease blossomed into something far darker. He didn't have time to analyze what Lucas had said. The storm was still raging outside, and the cave was their only refuge, no matter how unsettling it felt. They needed food. They needed warmth. They needed to survive, no matter what. The next few hours were a blur. Marcus gathered what he could from the cave, searching the walls for anything that might offer him a clue. The carvings seemed to shift in the firelight, as though they were alive, changing before his eyes. His thoughts were scattered, each new discovery driving him deeper into confusion. The storm outside howled, a constant reminder that the world was closing in on them, trapping them in this dark, cold tomb. Suddenly, a faint sound broke through the silence. A low, guttural noise, coming from the depths of the cave. Marcus froze. At first, he thought it was the wind, the storm playing tricks on his mind. But the sound came again, closer this time. It was a growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floor of the cave like a warning. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen, eyes scanning the darkness. Something was in here with them. Something alive. And it wasn't human. Lucas had heard it too. His eyes snapped open, wide with fear. It's here, he whispered. We're not alone. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing through the cave. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of movement, scraping against stone, something dragging across the floor. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed a nearby branch, the only weapon he had, and held it in front of him like a shield. His mind raced, trying to think of what it could be. A bear? No, they would have heard it coming. Wolves? Maybe. But the growls didn't sound like any animal he knew. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows against the walls, and then, through the smoke, Marcus saw something emerge from the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes, glaring at him from the shadows. It was a figure, large and hulking, its shape barely visible in the gloom. The eyes burned bright, locking onto Marcus with an intensity that made his blood run cold. "Lucas," Marcus whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Stay back." But it was too late. The creature, whatever it was, had already begun to move toward them. What followed was a blur of movement. The creature lunged, a dark mass of fur and claws, but Marcus was faster. He swung the branch with all his strength, connecting with the beast's side. It snarled, a sound that echoed through the cave like thunder, but the blow did little to stop it. The creature's eyes flashed with rage, and before Marcus could react, it was on him, its claws slashing at his chest. Pain erupted in his side as the creature's claws raked across his flesh. Marcus gritted his teeth, fighting to stay conscious. He swung again, hitting the creature in the face, but it only seemed to enrage it further. The beast's claws scraped against the stone, trying to get a better hold on him. And then, in a moment of desperate clarity, Marcus saw it, the symbol on the wall glowing faintly in the firelight. The same symbol he had traced earlier. The same symbol he now realized was a warning. "Lucas!" Marcus shouted, his voice breaking through the pain. "The cave. Get to the exit. Go!" But Lucas was already unconscious, his body limp and unresponsive, the fever having overtaken him completely. Marcus's vision blurred as he fought the creature, his body weakening with every passing second. But just when he thought he couldn't go on any longer, he saw it, a glint of metal, half buried in the cave floor. He grabbed it, feeling its cold surface beneath his fingertip. A knife, old and rusted, but sharp enough to do the job. With a final surge of strength, Marcus plunged the knife into the creature's side. The beast howled in agony, rearing back in pain. It stumbled away, its eyes burning with fury. And then, with one last roar, it disappeared into the shadows. Marcus collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving, blood seeping through his torn shirt. The storm outside continued to rage, but the immediate danger had passed. For now they had survived, but the true test was yet to come. Lucas was still unconscious, his breathing shallow. Marcus could hear his heart beating in his chest, louder than ever. The cave had shown him its darkness, but now it was time to find the light. With a final, labored breath, Marcus stood up, his legs shaking beneath him. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing: this was only the beginning. He had faced the shadows, and emerged from them. Now, he would face whatever came next, and he would do it with everything he had left.